Hello, everybody, and welcome in as we're joining you live from Dallas, Texas. We're joining you from my home office again today, as we're delighted to have you joining us for today. NVTV, we're live on all of our platforms. That's YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter. Another interesting show for you today, right? That's CDL Dallas, still things to talk on. CDL Chicago getting closer each and every single day. It should be a very hyped up event, but we still have a lot of things to cover, a lot of things to still discuss, things to unpack, a lot of unfinished business when it comes down to CDL Dallas. Today, we're talking on the LA Guerillas. Did they fall low of their expectations? I thought they'd be better. According to results, they weren't, but what is next for them? Also, what is happening with Seattle? Are they in the midst of making moves? I've been talking to a few sources. It seems as if that may or may not be in the works. And finally, who are the top four teams in the world? The biggest conversation that the Call of Duty scene is having as of right now is who is in your top four? I give mine and explain exactly why that's the case. All that and more ahead on Off the Break. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Off the Break, presented by Jack the Box. I'm Lando Sanders. Again, wishing that we were live from the Frontier Communications studio, but hopefully it kind of seems as if this is becoming a trend. I hope that we can be sooner or later in the Frontier Communications studio, but at the least, this will do for now. I'm not sure about anyone else, but it is currently pretty chilly here in Dallas. I have no idea why. My office seems to be the coldest room in the entire house, but it just happens to be. But hopefully, as the pun always goes, we can start to warm things up with the content that we are talking about today. Very happy to be here. Very happy to be talking COD with all of you. I want to give a very special thank you to all the folks that are listening to us or listening to Off the Break on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. If you haven't done so already, make sure to check out Off the Break on all podcast platforms in case you ever miss an episode. You know, reflecting back on CDL Dallas, it kind of got me thinking more and more on not just the final results, right? Not just on the final results and the positives, right? This team does well, this player does well, this team rises above the expectations. It didn't really get me thinking that way. It actually started to make me think more about the teams that didn't perform well, the players that didn't perform up to standard. One of those teams for me that did not perform to the standards that I laid for them was the LA Guerillas, right? I personally thought pretty highly of LAG coming into Dallas. In fact, they were supposed to be my breakout team. I had them beating Florida. They were supposed to be my Florida team, right? They were supposed, not that they were supposed to win the entire event and come out as a major shock, but and just in general, they were supposed to be my Mutineer lineup that surprised everybody at the very least. Like I said, not winning the event, but at the very least, surprising, making people turn their heads to say, hey, who is this roster? But do we need to consider this team better than we previously did? Which we all know the story. Florida comes out. Pharaoh plays fantastic. A real team effort. We talked about that last week, right? They break out of pools. They beat Chicago and later Minnesota. But the team that I thought had a real chance of turning some heads were the Guerillas, which led me to thinking, did the Guerillas fall low of their expectations, right? Did they underachieve in Dallas? Because it's very easy to look back now and say, of course they didn't, right? I mean, this team wasn't great before, and they're simply not great now. But there was some real hype generated around this team. There were multiple analysts along with myself. I think Merck was one of them who thought, you know what? This team could be pretty good. We shared the same thoughts on that, right? Vivid, Spart, and Blast, they get their second chance to really prove themselves. And now in an online atmosphere, right? They've got more chances to practice and work together. They're in an online environment, which should work well for most of these guys, as a majority of them do come from a most recent amateur background. But that wasn't the case, right? That was not the case whatsoever. Now, let's keep in mind that it wasn't going to be an easy first matchup, regardless, for the Guerillas, right? Considering the fact that they are facing off against the Dallas Empire in round one of their group, a team that matches up very, very well versus them. A better respawn team than most. Along with that, they're a great search and destroy team. That kind of works negatively toward the LA Guerillas because they're also a very good search and destroy team, a team that doesn't always rely in respawns. It doesn't pan out all that well. I figured, along with many, this wouldn't be an easy series for anybody, let alone a team that plays the style that LAG does. The Guerillas drop the hard point. They come back and win Arkalov Search and Destroy. LAG looked very good in this mode all throughout the weekend, but here versus Dallas, I thought it was very impressive considering how good the Empire are on Arkalov. Not really according to their record. It doesn't really showcase it, but if you really look at the details, the only losses that the Empire have suffered outside of this one versus LAG are a round 11 versus the Huntsman and a loss to FaZe, which we talked about at the time. That round 11, I think, was to a very hot Chicago team in Search and Destroy. And obviously FaZe considered to be one of the best, if not the best, Search and Destroy team in the entire world. Moving in the next game mode, right after the Search and Destroy, LAG has another situation, as I'm pretty sure they are the only team in the CDL to receive a forfeit. So much so that they now have found their second one, right? They have to do it again in the domination. They have to suffer through it. It is what it is. It happens. Player lags out. Player leaves after that. They don't follow precautions, not giving that a pass whatsoever. But even still yet, not a great look if you are LAG, given the situation that they're in at the time. Not a result that they want, especially at that moment in their very first series. But they do play a very close Hackney, right? That really comes down to the wire. The hard point gets extremely close. Dallas gets an excellent hold at P5. For those that have seen the highlights, Illy goes off. A mistake from LAG. Illy counters it. Dallas goes on to narrowly close out the series. But in leaving this particular matchup, I really wasn't all that disappointed with the Guerillas. I mean, I really wasn't, right? They win a Search and Destroy, and they should have won the Game 4 hardpoint. What happens if they go to a Game 5? Or what happens if they do see a Game 5 Search and Destroy? Granted, Dallas, great Search and Destroy team, but also it really would have been a solid battle between these two. And what would have happened based on popular opinion if we were to say, LAG, take Dallas to a Game 5? That just changes it all, right? The labeling itself, it changes it all. I left this series feeling pretty good about their next matchup, right? That being versus the Florida Mutineers. Now, looking back, a lot of people are going to say, oh, well, that's the team that won the tournament. At the time, though, this is a very different Florida Mutineer team, right? This is not the roster that we expected them to be. A Florida team that I predicted to actually lose the Game 5 versus Toronto. That ends up taking place. However, the next result here versus the LA Guerillas was all the opposite of what I expected. The Guerillas in this series out, losing the early hardpoint, which I thought was the biggest swing mode for this series. And I think it will be for their immediate future, is how good they can look in hardpoint, how good can they look in respawns. But in general, I think if the Guerillas want to be a contender, they need to be better in hardpoint because their S&D in Dallas was solid, right? And this is based on paper. This is a group that looks fantastic when it comes down to Search and Destroy. You look at this list, you look at the way that these guys, their background, where they come from, Vivid and Spart. Obviously, you have Blast on this team. You have Decimate, who's a previous Search and Destroy master of himself, right? Very, very good team. Aqua in his history has always been a pretty good Search and Destroy player at the least. Searching all the way back to Advanced Warfare, should be a good S&D team, which they are. But it's going to come down to respawns for me, and whether or not they can really kind of be a future contender. But the main thing for me in this series, not only losing the Game 1 hardpoint, which they probably wouldn't have won, I say that in retrospect now, but they probably wouldn't have won the Game 3 Dom, but they allow for Florida to get away with one of, if not their best map/mode combinations in their arsenal, which was on St. Petrograd, right? St. Petro Dom has been the key for Florida all year long. When I saw this pop up for the vetoes, my heart sank. It did, right? The Florida Mutineers are a team that have thrived off of St. Petro Dome. The fact that this gets through instantly started to make me worried. It's a map and a mode that has led Florida to a grand finals in Atlanta, and it's the game mode that has gotten them to a tournament victory now here in Dallas. LAG give Florida a massive advantage. It was always going to be a 2-1 as long as Florida won one of the first two maps, which historically and based on all of the wins that they had this weekend, it was all about winning either the game 1 hardpoint or the game 2 search and destroy. They weren't a team that was pretty much going to rely on the Dom to kind of change things up a little bit. They always held the 2-1 advantage whenever they won a series, either winning the game 1 hardpoint or closing out a very close search and destroy. Majority of the time it was the hardpoint. The hardpoint obviously gets kind of slipped through, but in this case, LAG don't win the hardpoint and they allow for Florida to have their best domination on one of their best modes. This was also one of the first times that we really saw the combo of Pharaoh and Frosty look great, right? This was one of the first times where we looked at this group and we were like, okay, all right, this is the team that we're expecting. Frosty's starting to come into his own. Pharaoh is now being the factor for this unit. And they combine when it comes down to that last, or rather, excuse me, when it came down to the first hard point, whenever we look at this one, it is a 67-34 performance for the Mutineers, right? Between Pharaoh and Frosty combined, 67-34. A rough way for the Guerillas to go out, losing 250-137 and getting knocked out of the tournament. Now, in retrospect, it's important to look at this for what it's worth, right? It's important to realize what really kind of took place with the Guerillas here. LAG come into a group where they've actually got a pretty solid chance. I know we're looking at Florida now in the current state of where they are, but let's forget that for a moment. Let's think about the Florida team that no one really knew what to expect, right? A group where LAG has a good chance to get out of. Dallas, a clear threat. Two other teams in a newly formed Toronto roster and a Florida group that is realistically playing their first real tournament with Pharaoh, a group that is coming off a top 6 placement. How is Pharaoh going to perform? Can they be that team? Clearly, they look great now, but in general, they face off against Dallas in round 1. They take a search and destroy on a good map from the Empire and nearly win the Hackney hardpoint to force the game 5. But based on an insane clutch from Illy on P5, we don't see that game 5 search and destroy happen, of which where the whole map would have been turned on its head. They win the S&D versus Florida, but they drop the crucial game 1. They give Florida a comfort pick when it comes down to the Dom, and the rest is history. So, is this loss a disappointing one for the LA Guerillas, right? Did the LA Guerillas underachieve? Yes, they did. The reason why I say that is because they should have been better, right? This is a team that should have been better than this, because in order to underachieve, you have to have something that shows that you can achieve in the first place. You have to realize that they lost to Dallas in a close series, right? You have to realize that this is actually a pretty close series that we have for them. And they later lose to the team that goes on to win the entire tournament. If I'm the Guerillas, I'm not taking that, but I'm realizing, you know what? Lost to two pretty good teams here. You know, we lost to two pretty solid teams when it comes down to the way that we played. If it wasn't for a few mistakes, I think LAG may have been that team that I thought they could be. They might have been able to live up to the expectations that we thought they could have. I understand that Call of Duty is a game of mistakes, and ensuring that those don't take place is kind of the key to victory. But my thoughts on the Guerillas, while I still don't see them making major moves in the future, I still think is notable, right? I don't think they're a horrible team. Not great yet, but also not horrible. They'll be in Chicago where it's going to be rough, but they have a chance to beat a currently weak Seattle team. And if they can improve on what they've struggled with previously in Dallas, they could show some pretty good signs, right? Florida, a somewhat similar team to Seattle. Great at respawns, not great in search and destroy. The Guerillas had that chance to do it over again. Speaking of do-overs, They also could have a rematch versus Dallas, right? They nearly go to a game 5 versus this team. What happens if they learn from their mistakes? What happens if they change up the roles again, right? Blast and Aqua changing up the main AR. Aqua did not look great this weekend, which is what I think was a big key for them in the way that they played. But if they switch those things up, what happens then? So the Guerillas, a disappointing loss at the Dallas home series, but because this team could have been better than many think. Some real potential, I still believe, with the young guns of LAG. I still think there's some good pieces here. And so do I think they underachieve? Yes, I think they do, because I think that they could and they should have been better. You know, one of my favorite discussions post CDL Dallas was the instant reaction that everybody had in the community was, well, what's the top 4 now? Right? Did Florida just eclipse the top 4 teams in the CDL with that win over the Rocker? Right? Did they prove enough this event to be put in that conversation? So let's go through it. Right? I've looked at this for days now. Right? I've got my current top 4 teams in the CDL. So let's go and run through it. Right? And for those who may be watching us right now, feel free, put in the chat, let us know on Twitter, tweet at myself at Lando, use the hashtag off the break. Top 4 teams, who do you have right now? So I'm going to go in order of mine. And starting off at number 1, I've got the Atlanta FaZe, right? To really no one's surprise, this team, especially after not being at Dallas, it actually kind of helped them a little bit, right? A lot of surprises, a lot of shocks for teams. This result, however, by not being there, kind of helped them. And in retrospect, it kind of helped them a little bit by not having to worry about all the major crazy defeats that we saw. Definitely hasn't really moved for me, this team. They look like the best team in the world still. They lose an incredibly close series to the only team that's caused them problems this year in the last event that they played at. Their only loss this season to the Minnesota Rocker. Again, we don't see them in Dallas, but going off what we know about this team, they should still be excellent. Right, they don't move away from my number 1 list. And kind of for me, the main worry, or rather the main phrase that I've said throughout this year, innocent until proven otherwise. Innocent until proven guilty. I don't have a reason to say that FaZe is guilty, right? To lower them to 2 or to lower them to 3. I don't have a reason for that. There's no reason to say that this team isn't as good as they've previously been, because there is no information saying otherwise. They lose to the Minnesota Rocker, but that's the only team that's caused them problems throughout the year. Again, not in Dallas. Again, really haven't lost a series outside of the one versus Minnesota Rocker that they probably shouldn't have won, right? That's the only loss they have this season. You got to keep Atlanta FaZe in the number 1 spot. I don't care who you are. Atlanta, still the number 1 team in the world. Number 2, I have the Chicago Huntsmen. Chicago Huntsmen, I've seen a few people start to move this team down the list a little bit. And I know I've been someone who's been very critical of Chicago, which I'll get into. Reason being is that they are held to a higher standard with the team that they have, right? You have a group of these players on paper. You have to hold them to a standard that is higher than many other rosters. So you have to critique the little things. The same thing goes for Atlanta FaZe. There just hasn't really been a whole lot to critique. The team that they've struggled against is the roster that coming in to Dallas was a top 4 team. Right, we'll get into where we have them right now, but the only loss that they've suffered is to a team that's pretty good. Chicago, really for them, they're held to a higher standard because they are in that elite level. At least for me, they used to be. Right? They didn't look solid in Atlanta when they go game 5, round 11 versus Toronto, a Toronto roster that did not look like the same team that we saw here in Dallas. A different roster, a team that did not look all that promising. Yet Chicago goes to a game 5, round 11. When they lose at the time by the worst score in CDL hardpoint history to the Rocker in game 1. Also, another kind of unfortunate situation. However, they do walk away with the rest of that in a 3-1 manner. Still, right? Have an unfortunate game 1 loss. We'll wipe that away. But they move on to the next series when they later get reverse swept by a hot Mutineers roster. Not a solid event in ATL, right? Not a solid event in Atlanta. Game 5, round 11 versus Toronto, right? You lose a very, very bad hard point versus the Minnesota Rocker, and then you move forward and you get reverse swept by the Mutineers, of which all 5 games were close. It very well could have been a 4-0 or a 5-0 for Florida. They were looking that good on that day. And I'll tell you what, LA didn't really make me feel all that much better about Chicago either. But they get the 3-0 versus Minnesota. Granted, every map was extremely close, but I'll give them that. Right, a 10-point hardpoint victory, a round 11 search and destroy, a 7-point domination win. They have a semi-close 3-1 victory over the Paris Legion, and they later get dropped in the rematch to Florida. The problem I had with Chicago is that they haven't really looked dominant really versus anybody in Atlanta or versus anybody in Dallas. I went back and I kind of counted up how many maps that they have played in both Atlanta and Dallas. Those maps, all of those equal out to 25. They played 25 maps total from Atlanta and Dallas collectively. In those in particular, just counting hardpoint, they've gone 6-4. Out of the 10 hardpoints they've played, only twice has the opponent not reached 200 points. And those other scores are 189 and 199. So you can pretty much say that 9 out of the 10 hardpoints, the enemy has at least reached a score of 200. When they lose S&D, they've lost dominantly. 6 2s, 6 1s. When they've won 4 to 5 times, they're going to a round 10 or a round 11 in search and destroy. The only dominant wins they've had were a domination versus Toronto in Atlanta and a domination victory versus Paris in LA. Out of 25 maps, that's it. That's realistically it. You look at the hardpoint victories, nothing really dominant. I mean, 250 to 189, 250 to 199, that's not dominant. That's a solid win, but it's not a dominant victory. The issues that I have for the Huntsmen is that they're winning close games and they're losing in dominant ways. Well, the Huntsmen sit in second of my power rankings. I'll be honest, it's kind of starting to teeter a little bit. It's starting to make me a little bit worried about this team because we really haven't seen the same roster that we saw in London. It hasn't been that same roster. But a major reason why they haven't shifted as much is because of who I have in third. And because of the way that they looked, and rather because of the way that this team looked in Dallas as well. That being Dallas's own, the Empire, right? The reason why I don't have Chicago really fluctuating all that much is because the team that would probably pass them is a team that didn't really do much better, if better at all. Right? The Dallas Empire, third place for me in my current standings right now of what I believe Benson has kind of called the Power Four, which I think is a great kind of name for it. Very accurate. I guess now you can kind of say Power Five, depending on how many, teams that are kind of up there right now. But in terms of my Power Four, as we'll label it, my current third team, the Dallas Empire. This roster, if they looked better in Dallas, would be in consideration to move upwards, right? If they win this event, if they win their own homestand, they're moving above Chicago in my eyes. But they didn't have an amazing home series themselves, right? Let's go over their kind of run, if you will. They have a tight series versus LAG, right? That one should have gone to a game 5. If it wasn't for a massive clutch that comes through from Illy in the Hackney Yard hardpoint, an insane comeback that they have. It was around, I think, maybe a 70, 80 point comeback, something like that. Regardless, they win it in a huge clutch that comes in from Illy. They hold P5. They win the rest of the series. They go game 5. I'm honestly a little bit worried about the Empire at that point. Their series later on versus Toronto goes to a game 5 in which they lose the game 3 Dom and the game 4 hardpoint. They have a somewhat closer series versus Minnesota. But they only managed to take the search and destroy, right? None of the respawns looked especially fantastic. Nobody looked like they were really on their A game. It was pretty much all highlighting Minnesota, as Minnesota finally got a big victory versus somebody that wasn't Atlanta. And that is kind of what carried on this team to obviously make it to a finals in which they looked like the ultimate front runner. This team in Dallas, didn't look really well polished, right? When it came down to respawns, they finished 3-3 in hardpoint. They finished 1-2 in domination. And they can't have that record considering the only top team that they faced off against in Dallas was the Rocker. But it was one event. I understand online was a problem for a lot of teams. And in the interview I did with Rambo, who, for those who don't know, obviously Codfather, right? A big veteran in the Call of Duty scene, current coach for the Dallas Empire. When I talked to Rambo in an interview I had with him, he said that they really struggled with the internet. They really struggle with a lot of these dedicated servers. And that is something that I mentioned last episode. Keep that in mind, right? As much as I want to talk about results, we all realize online is a factor. I get it. But in general, we have to take the information that we've got. We have to take what we have for right now. And when I talked to Rambo, the biggest thing he talked about was the servers that they were playing on, the teams that they were facing off against, the internet problems that they suffered. I get it. And I'm by no means giving them a pass. Keep that in mind. I'm not giving Dallas a pass for this by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not giving them a pass on their performance when it came down to their own homestand. But I've said this since pretty much the start of the season. I give you two events, right? One event, okay, everyone has their off series, right? Everyone has an off day. Everyone has an off weekend. I give you an event to be bad, but if it becomes a trend, that's when we start to raise the questions. So I'll give Dallas this weekend. But if we see it happen in Chicago, which is going to be a very difficult weekend for all of the top teams, that is when we'll start to really address it. Like I'm giving them this weekend a little bit. I'm a little bit kind when it comes down to it, but in general, not a great weekend from them. I thought they really had the potential to move upwards after what we saw from Chicago, but they didn't really put up all that much of an impressive result, considering the fact that they beat Toronto, they beat LAG, and that's really it. That's actually it. And both of those series were close. They lose to a Minnesota Rocker team, who obviously is a top caliber roster, but still, yet it's not easy to move this team up, and I can't move this team up. They can't move past third right now. But I will say I did like what I saw from Illy and Shotzi. I did. I thought that they played very, very well. Obviously, the slang in general just wasn't all that consistent from the other three, especially Krim and Clay. Had an event that I'm sure they'll like to forget. Let's just go and put it that way. But finally, right? Finally, the number 4 spot. This, for me, is between two teams. That being the Florida Mutineers and the Minnesota Rocker. But who gets this spot, right? Let's go ahead and proceed to compare the two. Right, the big conversation point is, hey, where does Florida rank? Does Minnesota get placed out of there? Does Dallas get placed out of there? Does Chicago get placed out of there? If you say FaZe, you're crazy. But otherwise, the other three, there's a conversation to be had there. But for me, it comes down to the Rocker right now. So let's go ahead and proceed to compare the two right now. Florida Mutineers, second in Atlanta, top 6 in LA, where they did have a new team, first in Dallas. They've beaten Chicago twice. They've beaten Minnesota. They've been in 2 grand finals, and now they have a title. Minnesota Rocker, top 4 in Atlanta, top 2 in LA, and top 2 in Dallas. They have beaten Atlanta. They're currently the only team to have done that. They've beaten Dallas, and now they as well have been in 2 grand finals. So who do you put there? I mean, really, 2 teams that make an excellent case for deserving a right to be in that conversation of a top 4 team in the world. 2 things decide this for me. 2 things decide who I have as my current 4th best team in the world. Those 2 factors, and I'm going to go ahead and say who I have right now. The 2 things that factor in are the way that Florida beat Minnesota in the Dallas home series final, and the fact that Florida now has a championship. We cannot under-highlight the amount of hype that the Minnesota Rocker had coming into that final. I put out tweets. The CDL was putting out tweets. The predictions were made from everybody. And 9 out of 10 people thought, this is Rockers. I even tweeted it out. I said, this is going to be the Minnesota Rockers' opportunity to finally claim a championship. when we left LAN, right? When we left the LAN environment in LA, it was Rocker going down. It was Rocker barely losing to the Dallas Empire. And so when it came down to the online environment, it was, this is this team's chance. And to be honest with you, they kind of exceeded my expectations. Obviously, people had Dallas and Chicago in the grand finals, but I was worried about the Rocker. I had a chance to sit down with Guerillas. I talked with him a little bit. He said, you know what, online, we're focused, we're ready to go, but it can be frustrating, right? I think Guerillas is in Maryland, Silly is in Las Vegas, Asim is in Canada. Obviously, there's a lot of teams that are now kind of dealing with that. I think Illy officially is back in Canada now as well. But still yet, internet, there can be problems there. There's not a whole lot of consistency with this team in terms of connection. Not talking about playing, but in terms of connection. So that was kind of my worry for this team coming into the event was, how are they going to play? How is the online environment going to treat this team? They were a team that was constantly brought up along with the Atlanta FaZe and along with the Dallas Empire, especially the Dallas Empire, on how would this team translate to an online environment, because this team clearly is better on LAN, and that's what Godarex told me. He said, we're going to be a much better team on LAN. Let's see how we do when it comes down to online, considering the issues that not just they are facing, but that the world is facing. So the way that Florida beat Minnesota in the Dallas home series final told me, all right, this is something to consider. This is a team that made the claim. This is a roster that looks fantastic. This is a team that's starting to hit their stride. And the most important thing about this is that while this was the best that we have seen from Florida, and I think this will probably be the best result that we see from them all year long, but it's important to think about the consistency of this team, because have we seen the best from some of their other players? Havoc looked fantastic this weekend, right? Route Man gets paid. He was playing his role. He was playing the way that SMGs are supposed to play in this game, which is to think about future spawns, which is to be kind of that blitz-minded player, if we're going back to Call of Duty Ghosts. He was playing that role. We saw someone step up alongside Mox, or rather, alongside what has been kind of the most consistent player for Florida in Skies. We saw Pharaoh be that guy. And speaking of Mox, we saw him play much better. We saw a team effort from Florida, and they finally had the second Slayer that they have been waiting on. They finally got that guy who stepped up and was one top player that wasn't an AR. Obviously, Frosty was there. And that's the big thing for me, too, is how great is Frosty going to be for the future? The big thing, the biggest story coming into the year when Florida was the original roster was, okay, let's look at this group, some inconsistent players. But if Frosty can be that guy, if Mox can be that guy, if Skies can be that guy, this is going to be a great team. And so far, they've been a good team. Granted, Mox hasn't had the greatest year, and I cater that a lot to the map. I cater that a lot to the maps and the way that this game plays with the meta, right? Flex is by no means highlighted, rated for London Royal Ravens, 0 for the subliners. No, not a whole lot of flexes are getting a lot of love right now. Obviously, there are some, like Celium and Godarex, and depending on what the Huntsmen do for the future, Arstys has looked great in that role. There's a few others still, but nonetheless, the way that Florida beat Minnesota and Dallas was so impressive to me because the Rocker looked like they had the ultimate advantage. Florida looked good, right? Obviously, Florida, they take down the Chicago Huntsmen, but nonetheless, the way that Minnesota was firing and the big conversation, if you talk to any pro player, the biggest thing coming into that grand final is the momentum that the team who just won now has. And that was the biggest thing for me with the Minnesota Rocker, right? If we're talking about the big thing that previously used to exist was the matter of teams getting burned out, right? That was the big storyline of, okay, this team coming in, they played a lot of matches today. They've kind of fired their way through the losers bracket. If this team comes through and they win, the first series 3-0, they're good for the next one. But the problem is if they visit multiple game fives, because that's when they can start to really hurt. That doesn't happen anymore with the format. Right? That doesn't happen anymore now with what we have. The thing with Florida was that they had waited a little bit, right? They beat the Huntsmen, great. But the Rocker had just come from beating a team that has caused them so many problems this year in Dallas. They finally take down this team, and now they look like the hot roster coming into this grand final. Everybody was talking about it. Like I said, I tweeted it. Every person thought that Minnesota was walking away with this, and I'm pretty sure that they thought it themselves. I'm pretty sure that they thought, finally, we're getting into a grand final where we don't have to deal with Dallas, where we don't have to deal with Chicago, where we don't have to deal with FaZe. Granted, it looked good versus FaZe, but nonetheless, they didn't have one of those final bosses staring them in the face. It's kind of funny considering the coach of the Florida Mutineers, but you get my point. The way that Florida beat not just Minnesota, but beat arguably the hottest Minnesota Rocker team, the hottest form that they have been in so far this season. The fact that they take them down, for me, is what gives them the edge. The second thing that gives them the edge, considering the way that Minnesota was playing, considering the fact that Assault was having fantastic moments, Alex was looking better, considering connection, Silly was looking like Mr. Consistent, even though Alex wasn't having the greatest event. Considering those things, the other is that Florida has a championship, right? They're 1-for-1. They lose to Atlanta, understandably so. But they have a championship now, and that counts for something. Granted, keep in mind, the only major kind of loss, which we've only had a few events, the only major loss that Florida has had this year is whenever they got top 6 in LA, and that was off of a very recent roster change. I thought for me that roster change meant more, but here in Dallas, it proved that that really was maybe more of an outlier. I thought it would be more of a consistent thing, but they kind of proved that it would be more of an outlier. Outside of what was a last-second roster change, which Prestini does not play for them in LA, they get one scrimmage. Coming into LA, they finish top 6. Not great, right? But outside of that, it's second in Atlanta and first in Dallas. Back-to-back grand final appearances, which it's hard to counter that with the Minnesota Rocker because they have a top 4 and 2 grand final appearances. But the big thing for me that eclipses all of that is the fact that Florida now has a championship, right? For me, all of my top 4 teams have a championship. Atlanta, Dallas, Chicago, and now Florida. That's the way that I look at it. And it could change, and it really wouldn't surprise me if Florida and Minnesota start to fluctuate, right? We're kind of in the conversation of where's Chicago at right now. The same conversation with where's Dallas at right now. It wouldn't surprise me if this fluctuates. I'll be honest, it would kind of surprise me if we see Florida raise higher than 4th, at least on my personal list, depending on where you have them. Like I said, feel free to let us know on social media. Hashtag off the break. Where do you have Florida right now in your top 4? But I had them in 4th. And it's hard for me to put them there. It really is, because I have tried to really go against the grain a little bit and saying, yeah, you know what? It's probably just one event they're going to be able to do this. And, we covered it. We covered it last episode. Can Florida be a contender for the future? It's going to be hard because they're constantly going to run up against difficult brackets. I think the one major chance that they're going to have is going to be in line. If you look at the teams they're going to face off, they're a real chance at that event. But outside of it, they've got Atlanta FaZe in pretty much every single bracket. If they don't, they have a major stacked group in a lot of the events that they're going to have. They can make it out of group stages, but right now Atlanta FaZe, they just look so good, which we'll have to see what kind of occurs with that. But for me, like I said, Minnesota right there in 5th, and it is probably a 4.5 rather than a 5th placement for the Rocker right now. I like the way that Chicago has looked. I like the way that they've played. Or did I say Chicago? I'm going to say I like the way that Florida have played recently, but we need to see a little bit more. I'm excited to see what continues to take place. I'll at least put it that way. I'm excited to see what continues to take place for both of these squads in particular, to see what can occur, to see how both these rosters begin to shape up. All right. Goodness gracious. Let's move on to Seattle. Now, there are a few people who I'm sure are probably wondering, okay, what's the sigh about, right? Why are we starting to get a little bit antsy about the Seattle roster? The big thing for me is that Seattle has been not just a talking point for the entire Call of Duty community, but they have been a major talking point here on Off the Break and on previous programming that I've been a part of, always talking about Seattle. And the reason why I've talked so much about Seattle is that I feel like I've nailed it with them. I do. I feel like I have nailed it with this team since the start. When this team originally formed, people thought top 4 team. No, that's the way it was. Regardless, I mean, you can go back, you can look at the Reddit threads, you can go back and look at the tweets. It was constant there. It was constant top 4, top 5. People had them top 2 in the world. People had them there. It's the truth. People had them in that conversation. And it's understandable. It is, because this team on paper heading into this year was great. Right? You got some veterans. You've got 5 world champions on this team. The oldest lineup in the CDL, which I give them flack for. But at the same time, hey, you've got some real good veterans here. You got guys who have experience. You got guys who are going to be great in the clutch, or so we thought. That was the biggest thing for me in Seattle, was that I like this group, but the problem that I had was the lack of star talent. It was the lack of real consistency that I thought that this group really had. And so far, that's kind of proven to be the case. It has proven to be the case with this team, that they are not the roster that many thought they were. Now, quickly, before we even begin to talk more about the Seattle team and the talks of, is it time, right? Is the clock ticking for Seattle? Is it time to make a roster move? I want to talk about what Seattle kind of has up next. Coming up for Seattle, Chicago, they'll be at that event, right? Atlanta is there. Dallas is there. Chicago is there. The clock is ticking on Seattle. And the timing for them is starting to become a little bit more worrisome. And the big thing when it comes down to Chicago specifically is that, as funny as it may sound, I know we talked about LAG at the start of the show today. They face a scrappy team that actually could counter them pretty well. Right? We talked about the Guerillas earlier. In the first round, that's going to be a team that's going to understand the way that Seattle plays, probably more than any other team in the CDL. Everyone knows how Seattle works. A good team in hardpoint, but they're going to get you down to the wire. And it's a matter of making those little minor plays at the end that'll get you over the hump. You're probably going to win the search and destroy, and it's probably going to be close. It's probably going to come down to around 11. Seattle's going to win the domination. They maybe win the hard point, depending on, again, another back and forth situation. Maybe you win the hard point, it's a 3-1, or you go to a game 5 and you beat them in search and destroy again. That's the way that Seattle plays. That's been a majority of their series, and that bared fruit again here in Dallas. But like I said, they're going to face off against a scrappy team in LAG who knows how they work and actually could counter them pretty well. I don't give them the domination. I think you probably could give them one of the hard points depending on the way that LAG works the vetoes. And I probably give LAG both the search and destroys. Now, I'm not saying that Seattle isn't even going to get past the first round with, or rather, they're not going to get a first round victory. But this is an LAG team that a lot of people are going to count out, and I don't think it's time to do that yet. It's at least time to give them a little bit of respect. Then, if Seattle does manage to get past LAG, they have to worry about Dallas Empire. And if they were to lose that series versus LAG, they have to worry about a very mysterious OGLA team, which seems to have Dashy now back in the lineup, which is probably a good thing. Based on in-game communication, we'll see how that works. But based off of just talent alone, that's scary. Not a great pool for the Seattle Surge. Seattle so far on the year, for those who are very familiar with this team, are going to be somewhat familiar when it comes down to these records. As we talked about it, as we kind of laid out their series history, 6-11 in hardpoint, 3-12 in search and destroy, and 7-3 in domination. People were hoping for improvement when it came down to Dallas. But it was a hard group for them, obviously, as we talked about a second ago. You had Chicago, you had Minnesota. I get it. Not easy. But again, they lived up to the same stereotype of search and destroy struggles, close hard points, solid domination victories. And the big thing to keep in mind is that when it comes down to Seattle, the results aren't that bad, right? I mean, looking at their results, they lose a Game 5, Round 11 versus Paris, arguably around that sixth best team in the world range. A Game 5, Round 11 versus Paris, and they lose a Game 5, Round 10 versus who? Minnesota, a team that goes to the Grand Finals. In my eyes, 5th best team in the world right now, and very well could be 4th. Those are two solid teams. Those are two solid teams, right? These don't sound like bad results because you know what? They're not. Those aren't bad results. The problem with Seattle is that they have had the same results like this all season. They've lost what? How many round 11 so far this year? It has been everything for them throughout this season has been the round 11 struggles. Most of their hard points come down to the wire, and they normally win the domination. They're an excellent dom team. And for people that say, oh, we'll give it time, right? They haven't played Atlanta. They haven't played Chicago yet either. Exactly. Thank God they haven't, because if so, they'd have 2 more losses. This isn't time to see, oh, well, let's see how this goes. The results are the same. The results are literally the exact same for the events that we've had. The progression, I get it. They're so on the cusp of walking away with victories, but it's the same thing over and over again. Don't give me the convo of, oh, they haven't played the teams in the world yet. We'll see how they play against them. What's going to happen here? Right? They're losing series versus teams that they should arguably beat. I doubt they're going to have a much better performance versus Chicago and Atlanta. You know, what happens if they go to a game 5 round 11 versus Chicago? Is that going to change it? No, it's going to pretty much remind me of the same thing, that Seattle should be better. Seattle on paper does not look like a horrible team. They're losing hard points 250 to 200 plus. It's not bad. It's not bad at all. They're losing search and destroys in round 11. They're winning dominations. Upcoming home series for Seattle. It's going to be rough. I'll be honest with you. It's not going to be easy for Seattle, a team that isn't really blessed with a great schedule for the rest of the CDL this season. Obviously, they're going to be in Chicago, as we labeled it, one of the most difficult tournaments of the entire season that still exists. There are probably 3 that I kind of have on my radar. And the problem with Seattle is that there aren't all 3 of those. In Chicago, they've got Dallas, Atlanta, Chicago to worry about. Whenever they're at their own home series, Huntsman and Rocker to worry about, which may not be the worst thing in the world. I'll give them that. Huntsman and Rocker. I think I said Huntsman in Chicago. My apologies. Huntsman and Rocker, still not the worst thing in the world. Nonetheless, you move forward. Minnesota, Atlanta, Rocker, Dallas, in their group. Oh, in their group. Seattle, Minnesota probably not looking all that great. London, Dallas, and Florida. Not horrible. And that's the reason why I said earlier, Florida, they've got a real chance to make it to the grand finals again in London. Seattle, a real chance to maybe make a run when it comes into London. But like I said, Chicago, you have Dallas, Atlanta, the Huntsman, Seattle, Huntsman and the Rocker, Minnesota, you have Atlanta, Minnesota, and Dallas in your group. London is doable. Toronto, not a chance. Chicago first round. Atlanta, Minnesota, Florida, and Dallas are also in this tournament. Teams you have to worry about. And the scary thing is, as well, is that I want to remind people really quickly about Seattle right now. And I want to ask you a question. Do you know the teams that Seattle have beaten this year? Do you know them? Right? You might know one, because if you know one, you know them all. The Los Angeles Guerillas, and that's it. They've only beaten one team this year on 2 different occasions. They beat them in a game 5, round 11 in London, and they beat them 3-0 in LA. Their only good series, their only real dominant series this year, and it was probably one of the most dominant, was versus the LAG in LA. The problem with Seattle is that time is running out. The clock is ticking on the Seattle Surge. Now, I have heard from a few people that are very close with a few different organizations, and I've heard that there is talk around the league that something may be happening with them. Something may be brewing for the Seattle Surge, which I think is probably a very good thing. And to that, I probably say it's probably about time, to be honest with you. It's probably about time that we see something really happen with the Seattle Surge. And as I've labeled it, and I haven't heard anything about particular players that they're going after All I've heard is that there are talks rather going on throughout the league about possible options, and I've heard that from a few different people. Typically, when that happens, it usually is the truth. And the ideal player that I mentioned, actually at the very start of the season, the ideal player that I feel like they needed to go after was the young SMG, right? The young SMG, slang first mentality, can roam, get work done, can learn from the veterans on this team, because there is a lot to learn from when it comes down to the rest of the guys on. A lot to take from when it comes down to this group. But this is a team that needs to make a move. Again, I've said it since this roster originally formed. Too many secondary pieces. Too many secondary pieces. They have great players that can be there to assist stars. Octane needs help. It has never been more accurate when we saw that graphic pop up, which actually that graphic that popped up on the CL stream that labeled how great Octane has been this year are the same stats that I labeled off leading into Dallas, right? Leading into the prediction show that we had here on Off the Break. Octane has looked like one of the best players in the world, and it is scary the fact that he's actually making a case for MVP despite being on arguably one of the worst teams in the CDL. Give him some help. Same thing just happened in Florida. What happens? Inconsistent players. They add in Pharaoh. Team is rejuvenated. And that's teaching them something. That's teaching the league something. A dominant AR needs help. The dominant AR needs someone to go alongside him, because that's going to change everything for this team. It really will. Right? You have a lot of players on here that can really do some damage if they have that one guy who's relied upon to get killed. Apathy can thrive off of that. Slack can thrive off of that. And as much as I liked Pander, the move that he made, it's just not enough. I'm not saying that Pander is the person to replace, but I'm saying it's just not enough yet. We still need more from them. We still need more from Seattle. This is a team, like I said, needs to make a move. Too many secondary pieces. They need more heavy hitters. They need more playmakers. A young SMG is what I think this roster needs. And according to what I've heard around the league, it very well could be possible that Seattle Surge could be making moves. But I'll tell you what, it's not going to be an easy rest of the season for the Surge. Like I said, 3 different events that are probably going to be the hardest of the rest of the year, and the Surge are involved in all 3 of those. But a great show today, really. I mean, a great show today. Had a great time talking some Call of Duty with everybody today. Again, a lot of things to be excited about post CDL Dallas. A lot of things to be excited about. Looking forward now to Chicago. It should be one of the best events of the season. Oh boy, I'll tell you what, it's gonna be great. I'm super excited to see exactly how Chicago wraps up, and there are tons of things to discuss, tons of conversations to have, tons of conversations that we need to have with other people as well. I've been posting on Reddit, been posting on Twitter as well, asking for the community's opinions on who would be great guests, who would be good people to bring on, and that's what I encourage you to feel free to leave in the comments. Who would you like to see interviewed on Off the Break? I'm happy to have anybody. I'm happy to have as many people as possible, whether it is coaches, whether it's players, talent, whoever it may be. Happy to bring people on. It should be a great time. Like I said, feel free to use the hashtag Off the Break. Tweet at me at Lando. Let me know who you'd like to see on the show. Happy to bring them on. Happy to talk some Call of Duty and just to kind of hear their thoughts, their opinions on different things, no matter who they are. Like I said, a great time. Always great talking Call of Duty, especially with you lovely people out there live. Obviously, the people who are also listening to us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, later down the line. Greatly, greatly appreciated for you listening to us as well. And like I said, you can feel free to make sure to tune into these shows because they are done live. You can catch Off the Break every Tuesday and Thursday at 6 p.m. Central Time. That's 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Like I said, feel free, catch the show. It's always fun to be here live. It's always great to interact with the chat and to hear what their thoughts are. As I think we did like a poll earlier asking who we thought, or rather where we thought the Florida Mutineers ranked. A lot of people thought they're kind of around that 3rd spot. But yeah, great show as always. Greatly appreciate it to everybody for tuning in. Enjoy the rest of your day wherever you may be. And we'll see you on Tuesday. Again, that's at 6 p.m. Central, 7 p.m. Eastern Time, following the boys on Contested. Have a great week, and thank you so much for watching Off the Break.